Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking how one of fantasy's most iconic elves was fundamentally altered on her journey from text to screen. If you've ever wondered how adapting a massive, sprawling book into a blockbuster film actually works behind the scenes, well, you are in the exact right place. We're going to take a close look at Arwen Undomiel from J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth and figure out exactly how her character was transformed to fit Peter Jackson's sweeping cinematic vision.
All right, let's just dive right in with a question that immediately highlights the huge changes made during the adaptation process. Who really saved Frodo Baggins from the Black Riders at the Ford of Brunnen? See, depending on whether you're holding a paperback or a giant bowl of popcorn, your answer is going to be completely different. And honestly, that single difference cracks open a really fascinating window into the nuts and bolts of cinematic storytelling.
So, here is our roadmap for today. First, Arwen in the books. Next, the filmmaker's dilemma. Then, expanding the Evenstar, the warrior-princess backlash, and finally, a choice of mortality.
Okay, part 1. Arwen in the books, a noble maiden.
To really grasp the movie changes, we've got to establish who Arwen originally was on the page. Her name actually translates to Noble Maiden in Sindarin. She was also known as the Evenstar because, quite simply, she was considered the most beautiful of the last generation of high elves in Middle-earth. In the book, she's depicted as this perfect, almost unattainable symbol. Scholars often point out that she follows a broader elvish pattern in Tolkien's work of retreating to safe havens. She largely stays in the background as a passive, guiding source of inspiration for our hero, Aragorn.
Get a load of this number, 2,700. That is roughly how old Arwen was when she first met a 20-year-old Aragorn in Rivendell. Aragorn actually fell in love with her at first sight. Talk about an age gap, right? It really puts the whole concept of an immortal elf dating a human into a pretty wild perspective.
But here is where the story gets super tricky for a visual medium like film. Aragorn meets Arwen at age 20. Then, they're reunited 30 years later in Lothlorien, where they pledge to marry. And finally, they tie the knot after the War of the Ring. The catch? This massive, sweeping romance is detailed almost entirely off-page. It's tucked away in a book appendix called The Tale of Aragorn and Arwen. During the actual main narrative of the books, she barely shows up at all.
Which brings us to part 2, the filmmaker's dilemma, adapting an appendix.
Imagine you're the screenwriter facing this 9-hour cinematic mountain to climb. Having essential romance hidden in a literary epilogue, that works beautifully in a novel, but is a total non-starter for a movie. You simply cannot have your main hero deeply motivated by a love interest the audience literally never sees until the very end of a sprawling trilogy. The filmmakers knew right away they had to drag this relationship out of the appendices and weave it directly into the main story. The writers, Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens, were incredibly self-aware about the massive liberties they were taking. They even joked on the DVD commentaries about their script changes being crimes against the book. But look, they were huge fans themselves. They knew exactly how much fidelity the community expected, but they also knew the books were unfilmable without some major transformation. So they set about translating Tolkien's core themes into a visual language, vastly expanding Arwen's role to make that romance an active, continuous presence.
All right, part 3, expanding the Evenstar, active changes. Remember our opening question? Well, here's the answer. In the book, an elf lord named Glorfindel rescues Frodo from the Black Riders. But in the movie, it's Arwen who single-handedly rescues him, wiping out the Riders with a sudden flood summoned by an incantation. Glorfindel isn't really a recurring character later on, so by giving his heroic moment to Arwen, the films gave her immediate agency. It established her extreme importance to the audience right from the jump. She wasn't just a pretty face in the background anymore, she was an active participant.
The underlying relationship dynamics got a massive overhaul too. In the text, Aragorn is actively, confidently pursuing the throne. In fact, Elrond requires him to become king of Gondor before he's allowed to marry Arwen. But the films shifted Aragorn into this reluctant hero who constantly doubts he even deserves that kind of power. And that change allowed Arwen to become his active voice of steadfast faith. She's the one rejecting his doubts and constantly urging him to meet his destiny. Notice how even physical objects were completely swapped or reassigned in the films to keep this relationship visually front and center. In the book, Arwen gives Frodo a white gem on a chain to help him cope with his trauma. But in the film, she gives a jeweled pendant, the Evenstar, to Aragorn as a visual token of their love. Same thing with her symbol of destiny. In the book, she spends her time off-page sewing a royal black banner for Aragorn. The film changes this entirely. Instead, Elrond brings Aragorn the reforged sword Anduril to spur him into action.
That leads us to part 4, the warrior princess backlash, the pivot.
Now, originally, this character expansion was going to go much, much further. The original script for the second film, The Two Towers, had a radically different arc for Arwen. She was supposed to travel to Lothlorien, bring the sword and Durrell to Aragorn early, and actually fight alongside the battalion of elves on the front lines at the Battle of Helm's Deep. Seriously, they even filmed scenes of Liv Tyler swinging her sword, Hadafang, in full armor.
But when photographs of Arwen in full armor leaked online, oh boy, a fierce fan backlash erupted. Hardcore fans felt this was a massive betrayal of Tolkien's text. They loudly objected to what Tolkien critic John D. Radcliffe famously dubbed Arwen Warrior Princess. The pressure from the wider community was just absolutely immense.
This clash resulted in an incredibly wild piece of meta filmmaking. The production team essentially pulled the plug mid-production. The writers, along with Liv Tyler, completely re-evaluated the changes. They went in and digitally scrubbed Arwen from the Helm's Deep battle sequences entirely. And as a result of this major pivot, Arwen was sent back to Rivendell, returning to the more passively feminine role described in the original text, kind of just languishing for most of the final two films.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, A Choice of Mortality, the thematic core.
Now that she was stranded back in Rivendell for the final two films, the writers had to figure out a new way to raise the stakes. To keep the audience invested while she was passively waiting around, the films introduced a slightly confusing plot device. We're told by Elrond that Arwen's fate has somehow become bound to the One Ring, and that she is quite literally dying. It was a heavy insertion of melodramatic tension that definitely wasn't in the books. Honestly, it was a bit awkward and left a lot of viewers with the false impression that she'd contracted some weird, unexplained magical illness tied to the ring, rather than grasping the thematic point that the fate of all mortals in Middle-earth was tied to its destruction. But you know what? Despite all the behind-the-scenes chaos, the cut battle scenes, and the awkward cinematic illnesses, both mediums ultimately arrive at the exact same emotional core. In the text, Arwen is an immortal who voluntarily chooses mortality out of love, which beautifully mirrors the ancient story of her ancestor, Luthien. And the film faithfully captures this exact theme. She chooses a mortal life with Aragorn over the immortality of her people, willingly giving up her passage to the Undying Lands. The journey was definitely different, but the destination remained completely true to Tolkien's vision.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought about that delicate balance between honoring a beloved book and crafting compelling cinema. Did the films ruin Arwen by changing her actions, or did they give her the cinematic story she actually deserved by visually translating her hidden importance? Adaptation is never just a straight line, it's a translation of themes. Arwen's transformation from a background figure in an appendix to an active presence on screen just proves exactly how complex that process really is. Thanks for joining me today, and keep questioning how your favorite stories are put together. Catch you next time.